Hello and welcome to the programme. Ukraine marks May the 8th as a day of remembrance and reconciliation to commemorate the victims of World War II. Now, on this day in 1945, Nazi Germany announced its surrender. Over 80 million people lost their lives in the Second World War. More than 700 towns and almost 30,000 villages were completely destroyed. To talk more about the day of remembrance and reconciliation, we welcome to the studio Serhiy Ryabenko, an expert of the Institute of National Remembrance. Hello, thank you so much for coming in today. So my first question is, since the war broke out in eastern Ukraine back in 2014, the way that World War II victims are remembered in Ukraine and in Russia has diverged significantly. Now, we see in Ukraine that it's a sort of a commemoration of collective memory, whereas in Russia, they're still used to this sort of Stalinist style.
Glorification.
Yeah, but I would say nationalist. I think nationalist is a misused word, but also sort of, defeat against the fascists, this sort of military parades, equipment, soldiers. It's very different. So I wanted to ask, as we see in Russia, how do you think memory should be used or shouldn't be used in everyday life now?
I think it should be used in everyday life now, even if we are speaking about the war that Ukraine nowadays have with Russian Federation in the eastern part of our country. We have still occupied territories. We have victims of this war. Very many people from Donetsk, from Lugansk, from Crimea, they saw what war is. And nowadays, speaking about the period of the Second World War, of the victims of that war, we understand clearly that the war is not only the victory. The war is the part of our history.
But this is the difference, is that in Ukraine, the victims of both Hitler and Stalin are honoured.
Yes, surely. But if we are speaking about the period of Second World War, about the days of commemoration of the 8th and the 9th of May, we still are speaking about, firstly, the victims of the Nazi regime, but we also remember the victims of the communist regime. Because we can remember that when the war started, when the German forces invaded the western part of Ukraine, very many people were imprisoned by the Soviet security services in prisons of the western Ukrainian cities, and they were killed, they were shot by the NKVD officers, and very many people, very many of their relatives, they did not know what happened to their relatives, and only when the Nazi forces came to Lviv, to Ivano-Frankivsk, to other cities, they opened that prisoners, and everybody watched and sees what the NKVD has done for these victims.
Yeah, and before the interview we were talking about the KGB archives, and I think we could talk about that in a separate interview, but I'm interested about the concept of memory itself. Where do you draw the line between making people in society more aware about the history of Ukraine and what Ukrainians went through during that time, especially the people who fought within the Ukrainian insurgent army and other these sorts of fighter groups, and telling people what to believe? Where do you draw that line?
So first of all, I think that about these parts of our history, the historians firstly should have their discussions for who is the hero and who is not the hero. On the next stage, the state can use the results of these historical researches for glorification, for naming the streets, the cities by the names of these heroes.
But surely it depends on the historians, though, because the historians already have their view on what history is. So should it be up to the historians?
Not only the historians, but first the historians should study the documents. They should have the interviews with the people who saw that period and who know what this period was look like. And after that, it can be used by the state. It can be used. The researches can be used by the mass media.
And how would they use this exactly? What sort of purpose would they have?
For example, the popularization prioritization of some historical researches because we understand that very many people, they are not ready to read very thick historical books with very many information, with very many details, with very many documents cited in these books, but they are eager and they are ready to read some popular material, some articles, watch some TV programs, look for some exhibitions, even play games. Because, for example, 2 years before, my colleagues and me in the Institute of National Remembrance, we start the process of making board games connected with some period of Ukrainian history. The first board game was connected with the period of Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-1921, and the second game was closely connected to for the fighting of Ukrainian insurgent army against the Nazis and against the Soviets during the period of Second World War.
Yeah, but I mean, these different ways, I mean, you said board games, TV programs, but ultimately they all come under education. So it's up to somebody to write the textbooks, and that must be incredibly difficult, no?
I think that difficult is to get information because as we are speaking about, for example, the KGB archives, not all that was written by the KGB officers in these documents are still true. So it is a very important duty for the historicals, for the researchers, for the people who comes to the archive to look to these documents, but to make comparison between these documents and other sources of information from that period.
Yeah, and do you think that this sort of historical memory should be used in modern society apart from perhaps when talking about the war? I mean, let's talk about the presidential election. Do you think that memory should be used in these sorts of situations?
I think that firstly, the historical discussions, except especially for this period, such periods of our history as the Second World War, as the fighting for independence, they firstly should be discussed between the historians, but not between the politicians. Because we have the example of our neighbors of the Polish state, when the politicians, they started historical discussions between them, and they created new and modern Polish myths connected with the period of Second World War and with the period of war between the Polish and Ukrainian insurgent movements. And it is not the good example that Ukraine should use.
But I want to give you an example that I saw a couple of weeks ago. Volodymyr Vetrovich, who's the head of the National Institute of Memory, he posted on Twitter a photo of a group of Germans doing the Nazi salute, except one person in the crowd. And the translation of the text was, "The majority is not a guarantee of righteousness." And this came after Zelensky was on course to win the presidential election. It happened on the day. This was an example of where modern politics is being used alongside modern society and modern history. So surely this is not right, no?
It was used exactly, but you see, Volodymyr Vetrovich is firstly he is a historian, and then he is the head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance.
And I appreciate that, like, it's not your opinion. I'm sure that you have different opinions. But if the head of a state body is tweeting stuff like this, that some people might agree with, some people might not, it's very divisive, then surely that doesn't set a very good example.
Maybe.
I mean, or does it set an example? Like, should the Ministry of Culture, for example, write about what Ukrainian culture is, or what Ukrainian history is?
Surely the Ministry of Culture, which business is to form the policy in the sphere of culture, he can write articles, he can he can take part in the discussions connected with the culture, and he can write the product connected with the culture. Also, the head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, whose activity is also closely connected with the formulation of this policy of national remembrance. He can write articles as being the historical, the man who has the historic education.
Well, he has his own version of history, though, and you have yours.
He may has, me also may have, and every citizen in Ukraine, he also may have his own vision.
I think it's interesting how in Ukraine, I think it's great actually how on May the 8th, the Soviets, the victims of Stalin and Hitler, as we described, are honoured. But I think it's interesting also how the people who lived in Western Ukraine during Poland in that time, but now it's Western Ukraine, when they were there, some of them did collaborate with the Nazis. It's not a secret. So why does May the 8th not also honour so much the Jewish victims?
So you see, in the Soviet period, the theme of Jewish victims, the theme of Holocaust was not a popular theme to discuss for very many reasons, but it was so. Nowadays, in independent Ukraine, we started speaking about this part.
But do we so much, though?
I think that we started speaking on this theme, but you see, we are speaking about the Second World War in complex, and we should speak about all parts, all how to say it?
All sides.
All visions, all sides of this war, speaking also about the theme of Holocaust, the theme of the Roma genocide, the theme of the people who lived in these occupied territories, the people who were fighting against the Nazis in the armies of the US, in the Soviet army, in the French liberation movement, also with the people who fight against the Nazis with their colleagues in the underground structures.
So you basically, I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but you think that more should be done to honour the Jewish victims who perhaps were victims of the local collaborators, let's say, just without naming them?
I think we should speak not only about the Jewish victims, but also about all the victims of the Nazi and communist regimes.
But I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the Jewish victims should be remembered more. Because at the moment, we talk about the victims of Stalin, we talk about the victims of Hitler, but we don't talk so much about the Jewish communities, and there were thousands who were killed.
I think that...
Am I wrong? Or
I think every person who was the victim of this Nazi or the communist regime, whether he was Ukrainian, whether he was Polish, whether he was a Jew, whether he was Roma, whether he was Russian man, so we should remember every person who was the victim of these regimes.
Yeah, and I know in Germany now there are some cases that are open against former Nazi individuals, and obviously there are not so many of them now. So why hasn't the Ukrainian state perhaps followed that example and gone after former Red Army fighters who fought against people who belonged to the Ukrainian insurgent army? Because under law, if I'm not mistaken, in 2015, they were recognized as the fighters of Ukrainian independence. And I appreciate that there's fewer of them now. Obviously, it's been at least 80 years now. So why does the Ukrainian state not do this?
So there are several reasons for what you are speaking. First of all these people who were fighting for the freedom of Ukraine, only in the year 2015 the state adopted the special law and said that all these people were fighting for the independence of Ukraine. During the Soviet period, all these people were seen as being criminals, as being those who were fighting against the Soviet state, and they should not be glorified, and they were, for the Soviet regime, communist regime, they were just criminals and no more. Nowadays, if we are speaking about the Germany, they started investigation these cases just after the Second World War was finished. We nowadays started all this process for the period more than 50 years after all these crimes took place. And nowadays, very many of those people who committed these crimes against Ukrainians. They are dead. They are not.
But I mean, it's been
alive.
4 years. Oh, I think just fewer than 4 years, or 3 years since that law was passed, because it was the end of 2015.
Yes.
So in that time, is it because there's other priorities? Obviously, Ukrainian officials are deciding which towns and settlements and cities to rename. There's symbols to be taken down or replaced. Obviously, we had a lot of the stuff with
partly it is because the prosecutor's office, the security services, the courts, the judges, they have another priorities, because nowadays we still have war, we still have war crimes that are committed by the Russian troops, by the Russian military men who came to the territory of Ukraine. And nowadays for the prosecutor's office it is much more priority to investigate these cases, but not the cases that connected the period of Second World War or even the period of 1920s, 1930s. On the other hand, there are some circumstances connected with the Ukrainian criminal law, because very many of these crimes are not exactly the war crimes or the crimes of genocide that can be investigated no matter in what time they took place, but they are crimes against humanity. And nowadays in the Ukrainian criminal code we do not have articles for the crimes against humanity to investigate. So we have to investigate these cases as ordinary killing or ordinary some kidnapping or something like that. And all these cases, according to the Ukrainian norms of criminal law, they have time limited for 15-20 years from the time they took places, and this is also such circumstances that should be taken into consideration.
I'm afraid we only have about 2 or 3 minutes left, but I want to ask you one question. Often, as I said, that there's a tendency to weaponize memory and this sort of thing, not just in Ukraine. That's very important. It's very broad across Central and Eastern Europe, especially in Russia, as we see. But you work with different memorial organizations in sort of Poland and across Central and Eastern Europe. So what sort of collaboration do you have with these different organizations?
So first of all, when we started working as the public servants in the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, we have very good collaboration with our Polish colleagues. We used their laws for the access to the former archives of the security services of the communist period. We used that when we were writing our law. Also, as the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, we are the part of the European platform of memory and conscience. It is the platform that was created in the in the year 2006 by the decision of European Parliament, and it includes very many governmental and non-governmental organizations from Europe, from America, from Canada, from other parts of the world, which provide their activity in the sphere of national remembrance and such process of commemoration. And we have meetings with our colleagues. We use their activities for our country, and we can also give for them our examples on how to deal with all these parts of history in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I'm sure that cooperation is going to grow further. And on that note, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for the interesting conversation. Thank you. That was Serhiy Ryabenko, an expert at the Institute of National Remembrance. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more here on UATV.